Welcome. I'll be using the next few minutes to introduce you to Old English. So let's begin. Before England was a thing, there were people who lived on the British Isles. These people were known as the Celts and the Picts. Now, the Celts are where we get the modern association of Celtic, and it seems that there was a significant conflict between these two groups, and the Romans eventually served as something of a buffer. So, in an effort to expand the Roman Empire, Julius Caesar invaded England in 55 BCE. He was not prepared for the Celtic resistance he received, and the Roman troops retreated. Caesar tried to invade England the following year, but again, he lost many ships and troops to the English Channel. Nearly 90 years later, in 43 CE, Emperor Claudius dispatched a force of 40,000 Romans to conquer England. Upon arrival, the Romans subdued the indigenous peoples and set up outposts for trade and primitive colonies. Some of the native Celts adapted to Roman language and rule, but many of them didn't appreciate the new Roman overlords, quote unquote, as they staged an uprising in 61 CE. Now, this uprising reportedly massacred 70,000 Romans and Romanized Britons. Rome sent reinforcements and maintained its hold on Britain until 410 CE. Now, during this time, the Romans essentially protected their territories, and incidentally the Celts, from threats from the Scots and Picts in the north. When the Romans withdrew, however, the Celts had no protection anymore from those threats. Enter Vortigern. He was king of the Romanized Celts, and he asked the tribes of the Germanic peoples from the European continent, so the Angles, the Saxons, and the Jutes, to come to Britain and to protect his people. These groups arrived. He asked and they came, and in 1449 they arrived, but instead of fighting off the Scots and the Picts and going home, these tribes, the Anglos, the Saxons, and the Jutes, eventually called the Anglo-Saxons, they drove all the natives peoples out of southern England, and they colonized the land for themselves. Okay? So we won't be differentiating much between these Germanic tribes from northern Germany and southern Denmark. Don't worry about that. Let's focus on the Angles. So the Angles called their language Englisk, and because they were the dominant group, the name stuck for the variety of dialects that would emerge in English, or in England, excuse me. The Angles shared many similarities with the Vikings. They were perceived as great warriors, and although they were originally pagan, they converted to Christianity about 150 to 200 years after settlement. Near the end of the English period, all Scandinavian invaders were called Danes, despite where they were from. Danes is a term you've probably heard of before. So, all of this to say that within the space of a few centuries, just a few hundred years, the Angles, the Saxons, and Jutes developed a distinct identity from those Germanic people remaining on the continent. So, we know some things about the Anglo-Saxon culture because of the writings left behind, but there's plenty of archaeological evidence too. It seems that most Anglo-Saxons were not concerned with writing, but they did appreciate the songs of the poets. Their sagas were later recorded with Christian overtones. Hint, hint, Beowulf. They were very skilled artisans, as we can see from the weapons, helmets, and metalwork left at the Sutton Hoo site. Their social structure, as would be England's social structure for hundreds of years, was based on fealty. So responsibility and tribute paid to a lord or king in exchange for protection. One such tribute was called fiorn, a food rent paid from peasant farmers to the ruling house. And it also seems, based on documentary and archaeological evidence, that malnutrition and famine were common in the early part of the Anglo-Saxon period, but this decreased throughout time. Okay, so the Anglo-Saxons settled into 7 kingdoms called the Heptarchy. But dominance shifted over time. So sometimes the Northumbrians were in power, sometimes those in Mercia. At the end of the period, Wessex would be the most powerful group and leaders against Scandinavian and Norman invasions. But keep in mind that when we speak of Old English, we actually mean the collection of all dialects. So all of the Angles, all of the Saxons, all of the Jutes, all of that is Old English spoken across the entire country. And for those who want kind of the historical background, this happened around 825 CE when King Egbert of Wessex, he establishes England as the center of power, and his descendants rule until the Danish overthrow. So, how do we know? Where do we find the written evidence that tells us all of this information? We look at the types of words existing in the language. If there wasn't a word for something, it may not have existed. So, for example, when studying Pi languages, it was noticed that there wasn't a common word for ocean. And so scholars assumed that the original speakers lived inland. We have written evidence of the Anglo-Saxons' lifestyle for the last 400 years of the period. We also have records of what the Anglo-Saxons, and Jutes were like before leaving the continent because of the Roman historian Tacitus and what he recorded in his On the Origin and Character of Germany. He made a general statement, made general statements about Germanic peoples as a whole, that they loved freedom and so on, but he also provided specific examples about groups like the Tentseri and Suebi. Okay? About 7 of the tribes he provided no commentary for, except that they worshiped an earth goddess and perform a ceremony which involves the ritual sacrifice of slaves. And later archaeological evidence would actually confirm this record. Okay, so when the Angles, Saxons, and Jutes first arrived, their interaction with the Celts and Romanized Britons were not peaceful at all. Anyone who could adapt to the Anglo-Saxon rule did, while others were either killed or driven to the hinterlands, Wales, Cornwall, and Scotland. This conflict has been referred to as genocide or as ethnic cleansing, as your textbook called it. Some refugees actually escaped across the Channel to Brittany in France, and this is interesting, given that, sorry, that is my mother. This is interesting given that the Anglo-Saxons would eventually be dominated by Normans, who are basically next door neighbors to Brittany. Okay, so what I want to do here now is talk a little bit about one of the great rulers of this time, and his name was Alfred the Great. He was one of the most significant rulers of the Old English period. He's the only English monarch to have such a positive epithet, so the Great, and we're going to compare that to Alfred the Unready in a later lecture. Alfred successfully fended off the Danish invasion of Wessex and, which I like about him, he encouraged literacy and learning. He actually learned to read at the age of 38 himself. He then translated or sponsored the translation of Christian works in Latin, and his scriptorium, which is a room set apart for writing, especially where manuscripts were copied, was responsible for copying manuscripts of many important classical texts. Okay, so his language, West Saxon, became something of the standard, and I want to talk a little bit about that now. So, West Saxon, partially due to military dominance and partly due to the promotion of literacy, thanks to Alfred the Great, became the most prevalent near standard dialect of Old English. Okay, most of the surviving texts from the period are in the West Saxon dialect. So despite the prevalence of West Saxon, that doesn't mean everyone was using it though. Okay, dialects continued to exist throughout the Old English period, well into the Middle English period. And this is what's really fascinating, this bottom bullet point. Each dialect became associated with stereotypes or assumptions about its speakers, right? And we'll talk a little bit about that later. So typically, people with northern dialects were more innovative in grammatical constructions, and this is because of the Scandinavian presence and Old Norse influence, and southern dialects were more conservative. Okay, let's look at vocabulary. The records we have of Old English vocabulary, relatively small. 23 to 24,000 words compared to the 500,000 in the most recent edition of the Oxford English Dictionary. Old English initially had few loan words, which is quite different from later versions of the language. Some Old English words remain in our language today, but these are primarily function words, which mark grammatical relations and don't really express meaning. Nouns, verbs, adjectives, and adverbs, what we call content words, they're lost or replaced eventually by loan words from other languages. Okay, Old English itself was typically written phonetically until the rise of West Saxon, when something approaching a standard sort of emerged in scribal training. In Old English, each letter, which is weird, was individually sounded, even double consonants. Okay. I want to briefly end by talking a little bit about inflection. So Old English inherited a system of stress accent, which means that stress was applied uniformly to the first syllable or root syllable of every language. If you hadn't noticed before, modern English, what we speak today, a bit less formal. Old English, like other Germanic and PIE languages, was a synthetic language, which means it was highly inflected. This means that verbs are conjugated while nouns, pronouns, adjectives, and demonstratives experience declension or are declined to show meaning. Okay, some conjugations and declensions are regular, others are classified as strong, similar to our modern system of classifying verbs as regular or irregular. So because meaning was conveyed through inflection, then word order wasn't as structured as it is in our language today. Okay, that was a lot. I know that was a lot. Listen to this video again and again if you have to. I'm sorry, my mom called in the middle of it. I have to go call her back, but expect a few more videos either tomorrow or Tuesday on Old English language. I just want to give you a brief base. As always, email or call or come visit if you can, if you have any questions. You guys have a great day.